Hello, everyone. So I will start by saying that you'll find more information on our presenters here today, the panelists and myself, in the agenda, because we're going to kind of go quickly into the topic. I'm also going to say that I use the pronouns she and her. And I want to thank you for being here today. And I also want to thank the organizers for putting this panel together and asking me to moderate it. The topics we're going to talk about today don't yet keep me up at night, but I definitely think about these things in my own free time. So if you feel free to reach out to me either at the conference or afterwards with anything that you agree with or disagree with, or if you want to share any people that you know that have worked on these topics, are working on these topics, or are interested to work on these topics. We're going to start off today. I'm going to give just a little bit of context, and then we are going to pass the mic over to Lucy, who's joining us online. And yes, I'm going to say it. So we have Lucy joining us online, and we also have Alec and Dan. So Lucy co-authored a recent report that's called The Planetary Solvency, and she co-authored this with members of the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries and the University of Exeter. Alec is an expert in risk-based assessments and operational and infrastructure resilience. And Dan has a variety of experience in industry and policy, including currently in food and produce. So after these short conversations, we're going to have a short conversation amongst ourselves, and then we're going to open the floor for your questions. So the context that I want to present today is the IPCC, IPBES, and IRP indicate that our current patterns of production and consumption are contributing to our triple crisis, or are in part inhibiting our ability to course correct. Indeed, we're in a very resource-intensive economy and society, from our lifestyles to our healthcare systems. And this intensive use of resources and raw materials is linked to our triple crisis of pollution, climate change, and biodiversity. Air pollution is linked to health impacts, which is linked to government costs, and as a resource-intensive system itself, is also linked to the use of resources, which is linked to the triple crisis. Climate change is linked to extreme weather events, such as fires, floods, droughts, and heat waves. Air pollution from fires, as well as heat waves, are linked to health impacts and healthcare, which is linked to government costs, use of resources, the triple crisis, and extreme weather events. Our responses, our extreme weather events responses in our communities are linked to cost to governments and are also mobilizing more resources that are linked to the triple crisis. Biodiversity loss is making us more vulnerable to pandemics. Pandemics that are by way of handouts and bailouts linked to cost to governments, and is also linked to health impacts and healthcare, which is linked to government costs, again, and use of resources, which is linked to the triple crisis and the pandemics. So we have here a system of feedback loops and links that give us a glimpse into the challenge that it is for our federal, provincial, and municipal governments to balance their budgets. The source of revenue for our governments is taxes, citizen taxes, our taxes. So maybe it gives us a glimpse into our challenge to be able to balance our personal budgets, and as well as our ability to afford homes, to buy homes, and to put food on the table. We say that we don't internalize the cost of environmental and social impacts. And while it's true that we don't internalize these costs in the cost of our products, what I want to say is that we are paying for these costs. We are paying for these costs through our healthcare systems, through our extreme weather events responses in our communities, through pandemics, as well as through bailouts and handouts. So we will now hand over the mic to Lucy, who I think will appear. So Lucy, once she appears, is going to look at this system of links and feedback loops through the lens of a natural risk assessment.
Great. Hopefully everybody can hear me and see me now. I'm going to talk to you today about planetary solvency, which is our fourth collaboration between the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries and a group of climate scientists. So firstly, with Sir David King and his group at the Climate Crisis Action Group, and then more recently with the group at the University of Exeter. A key theme throughout this is that we're not applying new science here. So this is already established science, but we're looking at it through a risk management lens. So it's all about sort of identifying risks, assessing them, reporting, and communicating them to policyholders. So I would just start off with defining planetary solvency. Then we'll think a little bit about what actuaries do in terms of managing financial risks and how we've reframed that into managing societal risks for the planet. And then we'll look at some of the planetary solvency outputs. So we start from the understanding that we are, as humans, our societies, our economies are dependent on the Earth system, and that the benefits the Earth system provides are not substitutable. We can't replace them by technology, and often once they're gone, they're lost forever. And this means that our economic and societal development and our risk management hangs on a healthy planet. And if we want our ongoing success...
Hold on, Lucy, sorry. Okay, go ahead, sorry, go on.
If we want to sort of stay solvent or ongoing prosperity within our planet, we need to manage that within planetary boundaries. So for those of you that aren't familiar with planetary boundaries, these are these scientifically established critical Earth system processes, so things like climate change, biosphere integrity, freshwater use, nutrient cycling, where scientists have identified limits to these, and if we pass those limits, we go past this threshold at which the environment can self-regulate. So if you have a risk background, you might already be thinking that this sounds quite familiar, and it sounds a bit like a risk limit. Needless to say, we're not currently achieving this. So in terms of where we are currently, we're seeing climate change and nature loss driven by human activity on a scale that threatens stability of the planet. We're already seeing these sort of unprecedented natural disasters, so fires, heat waves, floods, and these have knock-on effects on food security, destruction of homes, etc. And quite critically, we're at risk of triggering climate change tipping points. So that's what's shown in this slide here. And these are processes that once you set them off, they self-perpetuate. And if we look at some of the thresholds for these processes, we know that even at 1.5 degrees, we're at risk of crossing the thresholds for some of these. So when we look in what we call the Paris Agreement range, that 1.5 to 2 degree range, we're at risk of breaching thresholds for the Greenland ice sheet, the West Antarctic ice sheet, coral reefs, boreal permafrost, and Barents Sea ice. And to give an idea of how widespread and vast these impacts are, the Greenland and West Antarctic ice sheet contribute a combined increase to sea level of 10 meters. So very often when we're looking at climate change tipping points, we're looking at things that are really unadaptable. We can't sort of live in our society and continue our way of life if the full impacts of these are felt. And before that, everyone thinks that looks sort of too grim. That is over, very long time horizons. However, when we're looking at sort of future generations, and we'll come on to how we assess risk in terms of timeline cutoffs, it is really important that we look at the full timeline of these events. Similarly, again, if we want to scare ourselves even more, the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, or the AMOC, that's the big conveyor belt circulation that takes warm water from the tropics and disperses it to the poles. With 2.5 degrees of warming and AMOC collapse, more than half of the land suitable for growing wheat, maize and rice, so our staple food crops, could halve. And some scientists estimate that there's a 45% chance of AMOC collapse happening as early as 2040. Now, we're going to take a risk approach to this, and when you do that, we would normally say this risk really is too high given the widespread impacts of that. So we know these climate tipping points exist. We also know they can interact, and the impact of those interactions is to collectively lower the thresholds at which they're activated. So again, it's sort of more bad news. The thresholds I was talking about before are done on tipping points acting in isolation, but when you look at them together, the outcomes tend to be worse. And again, you can see some similarities with the themes we're talking about here, but also risk interactions. And we'll look at some of the interactions of risk as well later on. So we've defined planetary solvency as managing human activity to minimize the risk of societal disruption and the loss of our critical planetary support systems. So how did we get to this sort of lens? Well, actuaries manage financial risk every day. So we think about keeping companies solvent over the long term. So we're talking life insurers, pension funds, making sure they have enough assets today and at every single future time point to meet current and future liabilities with a high level of probability so that they're highly likely to remain solvent. And a large part of this is exploring risks. It's thinking about what might go wrong, and then it's identifying the actions we could take to bring those risks back to acceptable levels. And this means monitoring those risks. It means identifying when actions should be taken. And in planetary solvency, we have replaced the financial institution with the planet. So the concept is that our planet provides us with services, the raw materials, the food, the water, and if we want Earth to continue providing these benefits, we have to manage our natural assets sustainably. If we erode those assets, we lose the ecosystem services and we become insolvent. Now, if we're monitoring how we're currently doing, we would look at the planetary boundaries because these are the limits of our system that the scientists have identified to keep this planet hospitable. And if we do that, we know that we're already breaching many of these. So our sort of driving, our dashboard is saying we need to take action to avoid insolvency. And this would include things such as limiting global warming in line with the Paris Agreement, meeting commitments under the Global Biodiversity Framework and the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, if we don't take these corrective actions, we end up careering towards this sort of turbulent, insolvent planet. So I've sort of highlighted quite a lot of science, but I want to touch on how this looks like with a risk approach, because essentially what we've done is we've come up with a way of assessing risks so that we don't underestimate the impacts. Because one of the things that we found through working with this group of climate scientists and then looking about the impacts on society is that we consistently underestimate the impacts on climate change. And that's one of the reasons we surmise that we're heading towards this sort of insolvent Earth. So if we look at the resilience principles, and I'll skip through them quite quickly because we're limited on time today, but we are talking about a realistic risk assessment. And what does a realistic risk assessment mean? So we say a risk management approach means setting appropriate limits. It means identifying risks, recognizing that you're operating with high levels of uncertainty. So actually one of the key things is thinking about what you really want to avoid. And once you've done that, you can set appropriate limits for the levels of risk you're willing to take, and then you can monitor where you're tracking against them. And what that does is it encourages early action. So even when the science is uncertain and you can't pin down exactly when risks might occur or the exact temperature level they might emerge, you are saying, well, actually, those downsides are too important to ignore and we're going to take action regardless. That's what we would call a prudent approach with risk management. So, for example, with climate tipping points, where we have scientific evidence to say that the Greenland ice sheet might collapse between 0.8 degrees and 3 degrees of warming, the risk management approach would say, let's assume it's 0.8 degrees, it's on the lower end, and because we know that the impact of that happening is too big, we will assume prudence in this case. And if we're looking at appropriately managing risks, we need to look at the right indicators. So this is our Earth system primacy. We want indicators that are leading indicators, not lag indicators. If we're looking at things like GDP, we're shutting the stable door after the horse has bolted. We need to be looking at things that are going to tell us how our economy, how our societies might perform in the future. So looking at those planetary boundaries, those soil health, all of the things that tell us how stable our system might be. We also have to think in systems, so I'm going to click forward to a slide now that is actually from our previous report, but hopefully will draw a lot of attention and potentially discussion later. But this is sort of a systemic risk assessment, and a risk assessment has to be systemic because we know that the risks interact, we know that the responses interact. We said earlier, climate change, biodiversity loss, they interact to drive pandemic risk. You can see this quite clearly in our diagram here. This report was actually looking at how biodiversity loss and climate change interact to drive big societal risks. So you can see cascading through sort of infrastructure breakdown, food insecurity, water insecurity, right through to derailment risk. And for those that aren't familiar with derailment risk, because it's quite a new term, this is where governments and society are so caught up dealing with the consequences of climate change that they are unable to address the root cause and sort of green the economy and transition to a net zero economy. So if I just skip back to the resilience principles, we also need to think about the range of outcomes from our risk assessments. Now, again, I don't know if the concept of tail risk will be that familiar to people, but these are the low probability but high impact risks. So they occur at the tails of the risk distribution, so they have a low probability. But normally, these tail risks may well include outcomes that are so bad, we just want to neutralize the probability of that happening to the best of our ability. And crucially, we as a society have to decide which of those risk outcomes we find totally unacceptable and must avoid. And we have to make explicit value judgments about that. And so one of the key discussions when we were writing the paper was around the Paris Agreement and the well below 2 degrees. There's been work done by Johan Rockström on safe and just planetary boundaries. And what we find is that the just planetary boundaries, so when you're including as an assessment of fairness and societal impact, tends to actually be a lower level of warming than when you're just looking at Earth system stability on its own. And if we look at the cutoff for climate change, actually when you're looking at justice, that boundary moves from about 1.5 degrees down to 1 degree because the impacts are just so unfair. We also look at things like incentives to flag risks. Again, science versus risk mindset. In risk, we're always thinking ahead. We're thinking about the things that we can identify, and we are incentivized to sort of wave our hands and talk about them and flag those to policyholders. I'm going to skip on to the next slide because I know we're short on time today. But one of the things we did in the report was actually set out a planetary solvency risk appetite. Now, again, for those that aren't familiar with sort of risk management, a risk appetite just tells you how much risk you want to take. And it's in terms of the types of risk, the level of risk, you include all your time horizons. So when we did this sort of for a example, so again, this is our view of us. If we were writing a risk appetite statement, we would say we seek to minimize the risk of societal impacts driven by climate change and nature risks. That includes avoiding crossing climate tipping points, avoiding habitat loss and species extinctions, avoiding climate change above 1.5 degrees, avoiding climate change and nature-driven forced displacement, conflict and mass mortality, and avoiding derailment risk. Now, if you were doing this exercise in real life, you'd need a way broader range of stakeholders than a group of actuaries, scientists and social scientists in a room together thinking about what was, their idea of a climate risk appetite or a planetary solvency risk appetite. You would need stakeholders from all walks of life, all areas of the globe, to essentially discuss what types of risk society as a whole finds acceptable. But it's about being explicit in these statements about what we're willing to accept, the outcomes we're willing to accept, and the outcomes we're not willing to accept. It would apply those resilience principles. It would be systemic, collaborative. We'd look at non-linearities, so the potential for risks to interact, and we would bear in mind all time horizons. Now, perhaps, again, I don't want to sort of scare everybody, but we put this into a visual form. And this is very often the way in which risk appetite statements are communicated to boards, so your chief risk officers and so on. And essentially, we've said, these are the risks we've previously said we wanted to avoid in our risk appetite statement. Where are we currently positioned? So we said we wanted to be in the green region, but we're currently in the red region. So we're well outside of our tolerance levels, and we're acting as if we are instead seeking these risks. And so this is a communication exercise. It's about saying, if you've committed to the Paris Agreement to limit warming to well below 2 degrees, but you're actually operating with much higher levels of risk and you're way out of line with where you've said you're going to be. Now, we then pull this into a risk and likelihood impact matrix. So this is a subjective, it's a draft version. And this essentially, you have the probability along the bottom, so the likelihood, it's all qualitative. And we have the rating of the risks down the vertical. As I say, this is our definition. It's a proposal. It isn't definitive. But essentially, this gives you a way to place risks on a matrix. And then we end up with something like this. So you have your risk probability along the bottom, you have your impact of those risks on the y-axis, and then your positioning risks for climate change, for nature loss, for societal impacts and economy and mortality on this risk matrix. You have an initial risk position, so the light grey, and you have a risk trajectory, which is sort of where you're heading. This is a high-level example for the planetary solvency risk dashboard. You can actually find this online. There's a sort of a prototype version currently under construction. But we can see where our position is. So our sort of current trajectory for climate change, where we've got sort of limited impacts, but actually if we're looking forward, we're heading out into the sort of catastrophic and extreme. And actually, I think there's an argument to say that yes, the impacts are limited in some areas. They're certainly limited in terms of what we expect to experience later on. But again, it's going to depend who you are and where you live as to whether you consider impacts currently limited. Okay, so if I just jump behind the rationale for this and for the positions of where we've got in particular the climate risks, we know that we've got emissions still trending upwards. We also know that that translates into increases in atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration. And more importantly, we know that the trends have not reversed as we've shifted weather patterns. So we know that we get periods of relatively warmer years and relatively cooler years with the El Nino and La Nina periods. But what we know is that once we've exited that period of a relatively warmer year, the trend of higher than average temperatures hasn't actually reversed. Interestingly, one of the key things on this that we discussed, and we're looking at investigating further, is the issue of reduction in aerosols. So whilst we know that that is a positive impact, it's reduction in pollution, etc., the issue with aerosols is they have a warming effect. So they offset they have a cooling effect. They offset the warming effect of increased CO2. And the risk looking at this is that if we have a higher than expected climate sensitivity, so the amount of warming we get in response to increasing greenhouse gases, but that's offset by a higher cooling effect of aerosols, and we have two large offsetting numbers, and we remove one of those, you could potentially get the jump that we're seeing here. So one of the working parties we've set up off the back of the planetary solvency paper is one looking at climate sensitivity, which has been relatively stable from a scientific perspective, around 3 degrees for quite a long time. So that is the amount of warming you get if you double greenhouse gases in the atmosphere from pre-industrial levels. But as I say, if it's on the high end and it potentially is fat-tailed, there's a sort of about 20% probability it's higher than 4.5 degrees. So if it ends up being a bigger offsetting number, and again, the cooling effect of aerosols is bigger, then that might explain why we have this jump. And then finally, I'm going to wrap up. This just gives an idea of what the overall dashboard could look like. So you'd have your risk appetite, which was the graph I showed with all of the sort of colors. You'd have a risk matrix, so the chart where you can chart where you are in terms of likelihood and impact. And you'd summarize all of your assessment into a dashboard. So you would have your risk rating and your trend in the top right-hand corner. You'd have a risk position and a risk trajectory and an explanation for why you've made that assessment. And you'd also have some recommendations on the actions. We would call them management actions in the financial services sector. So these levers you can pull to get yourself back into tolerance. But here they are policy actions required to sort of bend that trajectory and bring you back into your risk tolerance. So I will end there. I would say the key recommendations of planetary solvency are it's going to be overwhelmingly positive to avoid planetary insolvency. And we can talk about that more in the discussion because I don't want people to take away that this is all doom and gloom. Yes, there are these massive risks. Yes, these risks are circular. Yes, they interact. But there are also offsetting positive social actions that we can take to accelerate activity in this area.
Thank you, Lucy. And we're running short on time, but I didn't see it in your presentation, but I did see it in a report, and maybe it was there, and I just didn't pick up on it, so sorry. But what was the estimate of the GDP decrease in the event that we don't course correct?
Yeah, I think we were looking at sort of a 50% impact. Again, it's a difficult one to unpick. If you look at the models, you need to look at the impact on growth of GDP and the absolute amount of GDP. And many of the impacts, and one of the reasons we underestimate it, just look at the reduction in GDP growth, and you get some quite wonky numbers out if you just do that.
And what was the time frame for the 50%?
It was 2050.
2050. So, and then I was wondering, what has been the response to this report? As much, in the realm or in the field of actuaries and policymakers, are you outliers in the field of actuaries, or are all actuaries kind of on board on this and saying, this is it?
No, I think it does depend, but it's a risk management way of looking at the science. And so I think most actuaries would look at this as a risk management problem and go, we're not treating it as a risk management problem. And that sounds a little bit crazy considering the massive amounts of societal risk we're running.
And what has been the response, because I think this is geared a bit towards policymakers. So what has been their response, so far?
Yeah, so we've had a mixed response. A lot of sort of our regulators and things are interested, so they will come and talk to us about it. And they're sort of aware of some of the issues. We're sort of out here, they're talking about it at various places. And so, yeah, it's been an overwhelmingly positive response to it. There have been other reports, again, where we've sort of spoken in as sort of expert witnesses, I guess, in parliamentary committees and things like that, not on this report, but on previous ones. So it is, I think, having that risk input into it, because it is a new view on it. We do bring something different to the scientists.
All right, thank you, Lucy. I'll just move on the conversation onto Alec. So again, thank you, Alec, Dan, and Lucy for accepting to have this really broad conversation here today. So Lucy presented kind of a spectrum of solvency versus insolvency, which was presented, in the form of, let's say, a renaissance and a decline. And from my understanding, I think that maybe your position where you're working at is to mitigate the decline with risk-based assessments to prepare, operations and infrastructure for future events. And I have a feeling, and I could be wrong, and we can correct this, is that part of the reason why you're working in this space is also because you're well attuned to the human behavior and capacity in facing, cognitive dissonance. So how are humans behaving as politicians who want to be reelected, or as a person who is a CEO and wants to keep their job, or as a homeowner who has a home in a flood zone but wants to keep insuring their home or wants to receive a bailout in the event that there is a flood. So, yeah. Any responses to that?
I really enjoyed the report, I must say, and one of the recommendations in it was to create something a bit like a ministry for the future. Mm-hmm. Kim Stanley Robinson has sort of his dreams have been fulfilled. But one of the things in the report, which I think was really important, is that it exposed large parts of the inherent complexity in what we're talking about. And in my view, it has been important for many years now that we acknowledge the complexity of this issue. A lot of politics needs to be reduced to sound bites. It needs to be reduced to simple concepts that voters will align with, and so on and so forth. And I don't see how you can reduce this level of complexity to a soundbite. It doesn't work. And, so putting across putting across what risk means to individuals, to corporations, to communities, to countries, means that you need a level of awareness that is not currently in the general public. If we look at, let's say, a corporation, and a corporation wants to investigate circular economy, they're asking, well, is this something we want to do? Our shareholders are saying we should be interested in this. Well, the first thing is that a lot of our investment thinking is based on, if I replace this asset with something else, what is my return on investment on that asset? And it's a linear relationship. It's not looking at the whole of the system, it's just a linear relationship. Now, quite often, when we talk about these measures, there isn't a great return on investment, particularly if, as an executive, your compensation is based upon a share price and an immediate return. But if you said, right, I'm going to black box this. So I'm not just talking about a boiler being replaced by a air source heat pump or something like that. I'm going to black box this and say, as an entire enterprise, what is the difference in doing these individual measures? And I will implement these individual measures as part of the routine preventative maintenance cycle. And the funny thing is that when you look at it as a black box, you can see profitability going up because your running expenses are going down, your return on investment is changing, but also your through-life equity is changing. If you think about share price or equity being within a funnel of probability, and that's defined by risk. And so you project out into the future a cone of risk, and your share price will be somewhere in there, bounce up and down according to how you're perceived in the market. In implementing these features, you can influence your future equity. Now, if we look at it in that entirety, and we can say it's systems thinking or whatever else, but if we look at it in its entirety and we look at it through life, the changes we make immediate and eminent financial sense. They make, they satisfy the questions and the demands of other stakeholders, not simply the immediate shareholders. And it fundamentally changes that perspective. You can't do that with politics. We're not looking at these things in political terms. So if you are, for example, you said a household owner who builds in a floodplain, and you get flooded one year, and everyone says, well, that's too bad, so the government bails you out. And the insurance companies, they go with it as well. And then you rebuild on the floodplain because you've got a lot of cash as sort of compensation of the terrible thing that happened. 5 years later, you are flooded and lose your house again. Can you really say it was unforeseeable? I mean, apart from building on a floodplain, can you really say that that was unforeseeable? So an insurance company would say, well, realistically, they know it's a floodplain. Should we really cover this? But we want to keep the business, so maybe we will. Government also bails out because we want to keep the votes. So we have just completely reversed the normal cycle of response to risks occurring. You compare that with, for example, the Somerset Meadows in the UK, near Salisbury Plain. Those have flooded periodically for about 5,000 years of history. It's no surprise when it floods. And so for people then to say, oh, I couldn't possibly have foreseen this, look how much I've lost, and I've got no insurance, the minister will quite reasonably say, too bad you made the choice to be on a floodplain. You made a choice. You now have to live with it. I don't think we're ready for that here. I'm not sure we're ready to actually say, you as an individual have made a choice about where you live. And so this becomes part of the political trade-off. And that's the complexity piece. We can't have a consistency. We can't say, yes, the actuarial tables are great. Everyone should understand them. They explain precisely what's going to happen in the future. That does not translate into understanding, a shared knowledge across the public, across the industries, across the housing sector. You can't get insurance for a mortgage, so you can't get a mortgage. Are we putting that awareness into the public? And I'm not sure we are.
I think, and I think I'll save this for, a question for amongst ourselves, and I'm just going to put it out there now, though, is, we're here because of human problem.
Yes.
We got ourselves here, and we're really intelligent on some things. But if we're looking at the way at how we're treating what's giving us life, which is these Earth systems, and I'll include in that, Mother Earth, but also, our birth mothers. It indicates that we're maybe not that evolved as a species. Yet we're the same humans trying to get us out of this problem, and can we? So I'm just going to table that for a little bit, and then we'll move on to Dan. So Dan, on this, Renaissance.
I need the clicker, I guess.
Oh yes.
Yeah,
yes.
sorry.
So on this Renaissance to decline spectrum, I think you think that it's possible that we can achieve this Renaissance, but we're not there yet. And to transform this system of links and feedbacks, we need to think about what's needed, how are we going to do this, and do we have the will and desire? So I'll let you go through your slides.
Yeah, I wanted to throw out, so thank you again for the opportunity, and couldn't agree more with what others have shared around the challenge. I'm coming from the position of currently working for the produce industry, fresh fruit and vegetable industry, and who is obviously very sensitive to climate change. Anyone would argue that water and soil matters. It matters to our industry. So that's not a conversation we need to have. The challenge is, I think, more about the change and the impact and the risk. And what I'm going to share comes from working with that industry, but also previously having worked with the telecom industry, the defense industry, the energy industry, the semiconductor industry, and the medical device industry. And what I'm going to share, I have seen in all of those industries. And it's a challenge around change, and it's a challenge around complexity, and it's those points. So the first part is really, what is the problem? And I think Lucy's done a very good job of laying out, there is this problem of a complexity of the system and the risk, et cetera. But I'm going to challenge that there's a root of the problem of change, which we need to also point to. And that's the systems part, the aversion, the change, and the diversity perspective. So I'm going to go to the first, which is about, it starts with the system, and it's all about interconnections. So again, looking for good quotes this morning, a bad system will be a good person every time. In other words, if you've designed a bad system or designed a system which has become bad, no matter all the good intent that you have, the system will win. And so what you see in systems change is the point that you've made about the complexity and how it overwhelms the decision-making process and the people within it. And I'm just by a show of hands, the lights are a bit bright. Who knows what an emergent property is? That's my point. The emergent property of a system is the characteristic of a system that no one single-handedly controls. It's the consequence of individual actions across the system that when they come together results in the state of the system. That's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with emergent properties of the system that no single entity actually controls. Mm-hmm. Those kinds of things make it challenging when having political decisions, we talked about, the governance structure. A single minister does not have the capacity with all of the resource and its people. It's a team sport. The other aspect is temporal, that these systems have a time dimension. So how many governments have an established foresight capability to look at future scenarios and anticipate and make decisions informed by it? Anyone's looked at what happened to Finland in the early 90s following the demise of the USSR was a requirement to more codify foresight into policymaking. I would argue that in many governments that capacity is significantly lacking. That's a systems piece. And I would commend, I think the last point is a lot of the work that the example that Lucy shared on the causal loop diagram is really important to understand the interdependencies. But it's how we take that and then identify where the material risk and where the priority actions can be taken in that system. For what it's worth, we're working with a company in Canada to actually take a causal loop model and identify where the leverage points are in that system. If you want to change the system, where do you put pressure? Or where do you put investment? And so on. So that's the system perspective. The second dimension is never underestimate the resistance to change. And again, there's endless good quotes here, but I think the point is, what is at the root of resistance to change? So anecdotally, if you take 100 people and you say, we're going to change, I've seen this across multiple industries, 20 are ready to do it. 20 will fight you to the death to not, and the other 60 will watch and see who wins. I've seen that pattern. Oh, that's a good heuristic if you want to apply one. So there's a psychology at play here. There's a challenge around just intrinsic resistance to change for various reasons. And I would distill it down to three things, which again I've seen describe why there's resistance to change or why there's a willingness to change, is the recognition of the need to change. If you talk about, there's the data, there's the information, isn't this sufficiently compelling? That's the need to. Doesn't answer the second part, which is the how to. So we need to change, we get it. How do we change? What do we change? When do we change it? That's the second dimension. But there's a third piece that fundamentally is key, is the want to change, the desire to change. So you can give all of the information, as I've said to my kids, knowledge is necessary but not sufficient. So there's the want. And I think that's an important part as we, again, talk about the different people involved, the desire to change or the complete opposite. And what's behind that aversion to change? To please never underestimate that resistance to change. And the third, which is loaded, is diversity is not a four-letter word. Again, the reason this quote resonated with me is the idea that there's a single or one solution. If you're dealing with these complex problems, there are likely multiple solutions. And so it is about having that diversity of perspective around these issues. And when I say diversity, the example is that if you're dealing with a societal environmental issue, in our world, that's land, that's water, that's energy use, that's material use, that's packaging. Where's the perspective of each of those around the table? We had a sustainability workshop last week in Montreal at our convention. That's exactly what we did. We brought those 5 perspectives in the room and said, if you want sustainable agricultural operations, those 5 have to talk together, not in silos, not in echo chambers, as we mentioned earlier. So that diversity piece is important. That is hard because you have to be able to get people of very differing perspectives, with different interests, to agree that the transformation of the system is paramount. I have a number of anecdotes that I could share around that, but I think when there's recognition that the complexity of the system is such that no single individual or entity can get it, they have to work together, and that the change of the system benefits everyone, you're on your way. So that recognition is important. Just think of human health as a metaphor. We talk about holistic health, we talk about these things, but it's about the nutritionist and the exercise and the sleep and the mental health. It's not an or thing, it's an and thing. So I think that the diversity is about how do we get that and thing in the room. And I will just point out that I'm sitting on a manuscript written with 4 other authors on this challenge. And the interesting part, if you remember Lucy's slide about Renaissance or decline, ironically, the title of our book is Renaissance Rising. It's the point that diversity is required to achieve that sort of system change. That's the basis of our thesis. So just to put that out there. And the last thing I'd like to say, and we talked about this, is the importance of diversity is generational. These conversations are even driven by young generations, old generations. My daughter studies sociology. She loves to point out that sociology is basically on the foundation of old white guys. And to a certain extent, she's right. But it's, okay, where is it going and how do we make sure we got that diversity? If you notice my quotes, they're all men. Again, that example of this is a challenge where this conversation is formed on old white guys. So that's my observations, and I would just close by saying again, and I love this quote because I think it really frames it. We can't solve our problems with the same thinking we use to get into them, or what we use to create those systems. But I would argue it's more than the thinking. It's the emotional dimension. It's that interpersonal dimension, which I think is really important if we're going to tackle this kind of challenge. And I'll tell you, in our industry, that's what I'm really excited about, because it's not just a cerebral exercise, it's an emotional one. To a certain extent. So thank you.
Thank you. Indeed, I think as humans, we, in our needs, we need relations, we need contacts. Yeah. And this is what feeds us. And when you talk about the diversity, it's also important because if you bring in other people, they bring in a different perspective. And, I'll share with everybody, and I shared with you, when I received your slides, I was triggered. I said, well, we're talking about diversity. We have here, quotes of, 5 men. And I'll even say, when I see Steve Jobs, I'm asking myself, is this the example that we want to base the transformation on? Do we want this to be our inspiration to, change our patterns of consumption and production and change our use of resources and raw materials? And, a response is, so this is what it's founded on, but that's the idea, is that if you bring diversity, they'll bring in different references, they'll bring in different experiences, and that enriches, the conversation. Because if it's the same people talking about the same things, we are all limited. It's impossible for everybody to
What was your comment before about you need to bring someone in that you disagree with?
Yes, I my proposal was that every delegate here should have brought someone in that they fundamentally disagree with. It would make for a more interesting dialogue, let's face it. But one of the things that I have always been concerned about is that when we talk about these subjects, we tend to talk in echo chambers. We're singing to the choir. Actually, the people who will affect change are not in this room. The people who will affect change are the ones who may be aware but do not subscribe to the need for change. So think of it this way. When you try and change something, you will have resistance. But if you introduce something new and it's shiny, and people like it, they will adopt it. So instead of saying, this is everything that's wrong with the world now, we need to change it, why can't we say, that's where we want to go? Look at the future. What do we need to be capable of to get there? And so we introduce new systems. We introduce new products. We introduce new items that allow us to transform to a shared outcome, a shared future. And it comes down to shared knowledge, shared insights, and shared solutions. So instead of trying to force change, because we will always have resistance, go forwards rather than focusing too much on today. But, that actually goes back into Peter Senge's point about the future. But nevertheless, if we can collectively listen to other perspectives better, and we can agree on a shared outcome, I think we'll be more successful. Has anyone read Catherine Hayhoe's recent book? Well, one of the things she talks about, and it's fascinating, is about let's find the common ground. What is it among all of the stakeholders that matters to everybody? Yeah, and not everyone is worried about, the biodiversity or whatever else. That's not a universal concern. What matters to everyone? And ultimately, you boil it down to human health and the health of your children. Yeah, that's what motivates people. So why not start to build a dialogue around how we create the world we want our children to inherit, and the world that will keep our children healthy and allow them to have their own children. It's a fundamentally different dialogue to the cataclysm that we are intent on talking about now. I think we should be looking forwards if we want change.
So starting with what is the, do you think that, for example, the report that Lucy presented, does it help for people to understand just how interrelated these issues are, and that it is linked to our planetary health, our human health, as well as our economic health? And if we look at that with that perspective, with the knowledge that we as humans, are built to avoid some of those issues, or to shy away from them, or to simplify them when they are complex. And what's the role of policy in that sense, where if we do have a common goal, but we understand that we as humans, we need to fight against ourselves, is what I'm saying. We need a structure that's there to fight against if we look at history and that we brought ourselves here, we kind of need something to counter.
Well, human beings are not very good at saying, you know what, I was completely wrong.
Mm-hmm. Or I don't know even.
Yeah, that's not human nature. I think Lucy's report, or the team that put that report together, I think they've hit the nail on the head. They really have. But what concerns me about the report is that it doesn't translate into the public realm.
Mm-hmm.
And the people that we need to convince will not pick up that report.
Aren't here. Mm-hmm.
Well, they won't read the report.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just they're here, because none of you invited them, I have to say, first of all.
You don't think that saying, GDP is at risk of decreasing by 50, and so this is another thing that is what's in the report. Is it that we don't know? Are some people don't know this and they're going to read this and know, or is it that we know and we're indeed not looking at it?
No, I think it's just that the knowledge is there. The knowledge is in the report.
Yeah, it's there again, but
But it's not a shared awareness of the same knowledge. And therefore, the insight does not resonate with the public and the stakeholders that need to affect change.
And I would add to that I think, it's a very good report. There's a lot to mine from it. There's insights around the interconnections that can be used and so on. But how does it turn into action?
Mm-hmm.
And again, back to the need to do, the how to do, and the want to do.
Mm-hmm.
So this helps to inform the need and starts to inform the what, or the how.
Mm-hmm.
Not the want. The want comes from somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a term we used to use, I stole it from a guy years ago. He said, it's the cost of inaction.
Yep.
If the cost of inaction is low, there is no action.
Mm-hmm.
So status quo doesn't cost me anything or costs me very little. If suddenly I can't get the house insured, I can't get this, the cost of inaction starts to go up. And it's not just a financial cost, it's those other costs. So, I say the most important things ultimately don't cost money. The cost of inaction on the health of my child or on the mental health of my child is not a dollar amount. It's something much more, I think, personal. So I think it's how do that information start to shape that? Because the worry I have is that, and I'm a systems thinker, and I look at this and I go, this is overwhelming to someone who's a systems thinker. Most people aren't. So they just look at it and it goes, and it locks. And there's a psychological phenomena around that as soon as you give people a 3-body problem, 3 things are interacting, most people shut down. It's not, and politically, as we talked about it briefly, it's a very difficult narrative politically to say that there are these 3 things are interdependent, and if we don't manage them correctly, that isn't a good political story. So we tend to want to revert back to the single issue, the silver bullet solution. But I think to your point, absolutely, that's part of the challenge. So that cost of inaction, I think, is really key.
Indeed. Lucy, I just want to give you a chance to, bounce back on anything that's been said to date before we kind of open the floor to the questions from the people in the room. So anything you want to bounce back on?
Yeah, I think I would agree in terms of who is sort of seeing the report and acting on it. And one of our key next steps is to develop the dashboard and get something that we can get under people's noses that they really just can't ignore. And that is sort of been quite a big focus from the start, has been how can we bring people together and get insights from different professions, different points of view, and leverage those, different audiences. Because when I look back and think about the relatively small profession that is the actuarial profession in the UK and the impact that the collective reports have had in terms of being publicised and where they've been picked up, it's been quite a lot bigger because they're used to us speaking out on the financial system. And unfortunately, because of the world we live in, people worry about the financial system way more than they worry about the planetary systems. And it's a bit of a twisted sort of way of the world works. But when we think about essentially bringing Tim Lenton into that sphere and saying, look, this guy has been doing this for decades. He has been researching this. He is one of the most respected climate scientists in the UK. And now suddenly he's teaming up with a group of financial systems bods, and he's having a much bigger impact through that. And it's just a different audience. It's the way people sort of respect different things. And I think that's sort of also combined with what is generally quite a prudent and cautious profession. We don't tend to shout about things unless we're really worried. And so when we come out and say, actually, guys, this is really bad, and actually, if you look at it in the way we look at it, you should be taking way earlier action and doing way more about it. Again, people tend to take note and think about how they can do it differently.
Thank you. And I was looking at my phone, not because I was looking at my phone. I was trying to get the questions from the crowd, and I can't seem to connect. So if anybody has a question, you guys can go up to the mic, or we're in a small group, or maybe we're able to. Yes, did you have I saw a hand.
So to your point about the want of change, right? Do you think we have a lever right now because of the situation with the U.S. and the fact that, Canada, the Canadians would, have this kind of common, how can we tap into that, I guess, is what I would.
I think your point, just briefly, I think what's happening in Canada is more of an emotional reaction. I think Canada's always had a risk that the U.S. economy is so large that if things were to shift in the U.S., when I came back from Finland to go and learn about how Finland had navigated the post-USSR scenario, I went, Canada's eventually going to go through the same thing if something in the U.S. goes south or sideways. So here we are. That's an emotional reaction that we're having. And so to the extent the want is coming from that, well, we thought we were friends, we thought, and now suddenly we're not. I don't know that we're getting that in something what you could argue, to use Lucy's report, is an extremely slow, incredibly traumatic train wreck. We don't respond well to that. We're much better at, oh my God, here comes the train wreck, now I'll react. But once that temporal dimension is measured in years or longer, I think we struggle, honestly, as a species. And Dan Gardner, who's written a lot about this, Canadian, on risk, the whole psychology of that is really important to understand, because all the policies and the levers in the world, if they ignore that, I think that could be a part that just defines how people ultimately will act.
And I think with regards to the tariffs, we all have a lens and we all have a posture that we, typically repeat. So I work in the space of the circular economy, and when the tariffs come up, we're saying this is going to be a great opportunity. People are going to understand instinctively, what is the benefit of having short circuits. But then we're talking to other people in the space and we're saying, what is the reaction? Are people now able to understand, through instinct, that we should really kind of look into these closed circuits and stop extracting and using the resources that we actually have? And the response is no. So I think it, depends where you're coming from, what's your lens, and you're going to apply that to different scenarios. And even if you have certain evidence at times, whether it's, risk report or tariffs like this, it's not necessarily going to, on its own, change your perspective or change your actions. Did anybody else want to react to that? Or do we have any other questions in the crowd? Anything else that you guys want to bounce back on things that we've said or things that we haven't said?
Well, just to that last question, one point springs to mind is that, yes, it's an opportunity. But it has also exposed an inherent weakness in the Canadian economy, that since the 90s we've had this philosophy that we're a resource economy, which ironically enough in the previous plenary session was the description of the Global South. We've outsourced our processing to the US. And so a lot of the reaction and the ability to take advantage of this opportunity exposes a dependency we have on the US still to process the stuff we need for circularity. So depending on which sector you're in, whether it was outsourced or not, we've got this almost spotty capacity to take advantage of the opportunity. But I think it's also interesting that Canada holds, what's it, 350 billion of US debt, something like that. It's a significant amount. We're about hold the fourth largest amount. Now, if that debt were flooded or something, it would be difficult to get a mortgage in the US. Canada has opportunities. Canada has energy. It can have national security in energy, food, water, all of the things that matters. If, ironically enough, we were prepared to have a dialogue within Canada and actually talk to each other.
Agree.
Which I'm afraid I'm not sure that we do.
There's a question there, I think.
Yes, hello.
Yes, I'm appreciating everything everyone's saying, and in the fields I work in, there's things like in addiction theory, where we're talking about, do we have to hit bottom in order to change, right? And those of us in the ecological movement and so on, it's this reality, does the planet have to get so screwed that, that will evoke the change? Or as many of us, okay, you don't have to hit bottom. We know rational arguments aren't going to change you. How do we respond at an emotive level? How do we change the story, the narratives, and all those kinds of things. And I think all of you are pointing in that kind of direction. And those of us who are trying to be change agents, how do we get that 5 or 10% change agents motivated enough to get us moving in this direction?
Can I offer something?
Yes.
So by a show of hands, who knows what a pre-mortem is? So a pre-mortem is a military exercise that takes a scenario, it's pre-mortem. We lost. I learned it from basically who was the vice chief of defense staff in Canada. We've applied it to business. The most interesting conversation was sitting down with a CEO and all the VPs of a major company and going through a pre-mortem that basically what they were planning to do and the contract they had completely failed. So reputationally, they were destroyed. Financially, it hurt them. And it created an emotional context that identified the actions and the things that they needed to do. So back to Lucy's chart of probability and impact. It identified the things that could happen that would lead to that. And the entire action plan was built from that pre-mortem exercise. I would argue that we start doing that with the right people in the room, we start to have this reaction of, right, because then I see the part I could do, I see the part you could do, because we've all emotionally, for that half day or day or go, crap, right. I think that starts to get closer to that kind of objective. And I've done it in a number of instances that it's really fascinating to watch. Do you see that emotional part happen? And people go, okay, how do we solve this problem?
Yeah. And I think it's, interesting bringing back, emotions. I mean, and this is about diversity and looking at different perspectives. So, you brought up addiction. I think it's a really good one. You're bringing up military, and there's a common thread there of, emotions. And I think it's something for us to keep in mind. And so we're now going to, break for lunch. But I want to, thank you. And I understand that this panel, we haven't necessarily presented, the solutions. It's really more about planting some seeds and to consider those. And it's, it's going to evolve. We'll think about these topics tomorrow and, we'll have made some new links and said, oh, I didn't understand that. Or, if I were to address that today, this is how I would talk about it. Same thing in, a week from now or a year from now. And that's kind of the intent. So thank you very much. Bon appétit. And thank you, Lucy, Dan, and Alec. Thanks.